Let's get this over with.
Thank you.
So
That's
Peter,
a great introduction. Thanks, Jeff.
so this is the guy Peter Eisenman we've been hearing about. So Peter, I'm going to just let you talk, and when you're done, I'll come back and ask questions. Okay.
Okay, and if you can't hear me, let me know.
Okay.
All right. Should I begin?
Yep. Got it.
Okay. Thank you. I'm first of all sorry that I can't be with a lot of my friends and Madame Derrida and all of the organizers, but I am at an event in one of my buildings, which is being celebrated its anniversary today, and it's something that I guess I had to be at. So hopefully Skype, new modern technology will allow me to present what I need to for you. I want to tell you how this paper began quickly before I read the paper. I was giving a student project at Yale University on a drawing that Giuseppe Tarani, the Italian architect, made when he designed the Casa del Fascio. And in that design was a second building mirrored next to the Casa del Fascio, the same size and shape. And I thought to assign this symmetrical projection, let's say, for students to design what was not designed in the site plan. This led me to think about two of Jacques Derrida's colleagues, Jacques Lacan and Gilles Deleuze. And I'd always wanted to understand the differences between Lacan, Deleuze, and Derrida, never once thinking I would have that opportunity. And so I assigned the students to read Lacan's Mirror Stage, which deals with the question of a child seeing his reflection in the mirror, seeing it as a more perfect condition of being than himself. And I thought this was interesting but problematic. And I wanted to figure out what it was that was disturbing me about the Lacanian project, and because I had heard a lot about it. And I was taken to look in the book Écrit, and the first essay in L'Écrit is an essay by Lacan called The Seminar on the Purloined Letter. And upon investigating further, I found out that it was in fact Jacques Derrida who replied to Lacan's seminar in an essay entitled The Purveyor of Truth, published in 1975 by Graphices, the Journal of Yale French Studies, which would give me a clue as to not so much about the mirror stage, but about the philosophic relationship between Lacan and Derrida. And what I'm going to present today is a preliminary work that I've done, presented to my students at Yale who are working on this project now, using these texts, the mirror stage, the seminar, Derrida's Purveyor of Truth, and Edgar Allan Poe's essay, The Purloined Letter, which was the subject of the critique in the seminar and also the subject of Derrida's critique. And it's very interesting to compare the difference between the Lacanian critique and the Derridian critique of this Poe story. So, in a sense, this is a kind of introduction to work that I'm doing on the differences for architecture now between Lacan, Derrida, and Deleuze. So briefly I will introduce this paper. It's called Derrida Doubled, and it has an introductory sentence from Edgar Allan Poe's The Murders in the Rue Morgue, which is the second in the trilogy of mystery stories, first published by Poe in 1841. The Dupin mysteries, of which the Proline letter is the third. The quote, which I find very important especially for architecture today and the conditions that we find architecture in, it goes as follows. The ingenious are always fanciful, but the truly imaginative never otherwise than analytic. And you'll see from what follows the relevance of that particular quote. The mystery story is the quintessential modern literary genre. As such, it has been subjected to much analysis, particularly from outside the discipline. One of the most thoroughly argued mysteries concerns Edgar Allan Poe's The Proline Letter, written shortly after The Murders in the Rue Morgue. This story is one of three about a man called Auguste Dupin, a Parisian of some former means, who solves mysteries by using the logic of common sense. The story became the setting for an exchange between Jacques Lacan and Jacques Derrida, when Lacan wrote his seminar on the Proline Letter in 1956, which 10 years later Lacan chose to introduce the first volume of his collected writings, Écrits, with the seminar essay. Using the seminar as a focus, Jacques Derrida critiqued the Lacanian project in an essay he titled The Purveyor of Truth. This exchange, in quotes, between Derrida and Lacan is useful in that it poses an analogical context easily transformed into architecture. In itself, the Poe story is about a stolen letter, its facsimile, and the three characters who have an interest in finding or stealing it to use as blackmail against one of their number. It is in this context that Lacan sees the story as a triadic relationship, and because he is a psychoanalyst, he sees these three relationships for their psychological motivations. Lacan's seminar provides Derrida with the opportunity to distance himself from the Lacanian project, but to also illustrate his own argument. In the critique of Lacan's analysis of the story, Derrida argues that the story is not about three or a triadic relationship, but 2 plus 2, a quaternity, a relationship not like the one proposed by Lacan. Derrida writes in The Purveyor of Truth, if the dual relationship between two doubles, which Lacan would reduce to the imaginary, that is, in the mirror stage, includes and envelops the entire space said to be of the symbolic overflows and simulates it, ceaselessly ruining and disorganizing it, then the opposition of the imaginary and the symbolic, and above all its implicit hierarchy, appears to be of very limited pertinence. That is, if one measures it against the squaring of such, i.e. the quaternity, as a scene of writing. Derrida continues, suggesting that the phenomena of the double, and therefore of the Unheimlichkeit, or the uncanny, do not belong only to a trilogic context of the Proline Letter. Against this Lacanian psychoanalytic model, Derrida argues that the Proline Letter carries us into a labyrinth of doubles without originals, of facsimiles without an authentic and indivisible letter. This, he says, helps to unlock a reading, the play of doubles, divisibility without end, textual references from facsimile to facsimile, the framing of frames, the interminable supplementarity of the quotation marks. There is in this exchange a clear difference between Derrida and Lacan over the question of the relationship of the signifier to the signified, that is, the sign to the object. In this context, Lacan, in his essay, can be seen as a structuralist, following from de Saussure's idea of the immutable relationship of the sign to the signified, while Derrida, as a post-structuralist, believes that there is no transcendental signified, no thing, one thing before all others. Derrida questioned Lacan's stress on the possibility of a, in quotes, truth in presence, in the presence of the signified, that is. Derrida argues that Lacan turns the Proline letter, that is the actual letter, from a signifier or sign of something into a signified, the thing itself. Thus, Lacan, what was formerly thought of as the signifier of the story, the letter to become pure presence. This is because Lacan does not believe that what Poe wrote is anything but a narrative, and that this narrative takes precedence over what Derrida says is not available in just any fiction, which is, for Derrida, the idea of a text. For Derrida, the text is the presence in presence of non-presence. Ultimately, Derrida questions the fact of any truth in presence in this particular essay. This questioning of the premises for presence is important, in particular for what it tells us about Derrida and architecture, the discipline, according to Derrida, most bound to presence. It could be argued that Derrida levels a critique at Lacan because of his emphasis on the analysis of narrative, i.e. of speech over writing, and thus presence over non-presence. But at the same time, Derrida is questioning something else, Lacan's logocentrism in the privileging of speech over writing. Finally, Derrida questions Lacan on his inability to distinguish between different types of narrative in fiction, particularly when they display possible literary qualities. Derrida argues that Lacan's psychoanalytic reading eliminates the literary from the textual. And if we shift to the context of architecture, such an idea of the literary would equate to what I would call the possibility of an architecturalness within architecture, that is, architecturalness in quotation marks. Something other than what one could consider as design or the design of a narrative. Literariness is language around which a frame has been drawn. That is, when it calls attention to itself as writing. What such a metaphorical frame would be for architecture is elusive. It is not merely a plinth or the trace of non-presence in presence. These would be too narratological. Derrida's work, according to Barbara Johnson, is to see the idea of a frame as a borderline case, to study the limits of spatial logic as it relates to intelligibility, i.e., what something must look like. Johnson says that the range of Derrida's are located not in the geometrical, that is, homogeneous, finite space, but in the implicit notion of what seeing is, that is, what it is that a text must look like. This reminds me of my first lesson in architecture given to me by Colin Rowe while on a visit to a Palladian villa in Italy in the year 1961. He said to me at that time, and this is what is incredibly important in this context, while looking at the villa, he said, "Tell me what you see that is not there." In other words, to see as what I consider an architect must learn to see, as opposed to a psychoanalyst or a philosopher. Well, according to Johnson, Derrida follows this theme of seeing what is not there and not the function of writing within the context of representation. In my view, this is not something that Derrida allows for in architecture. So while he understands that he must move away from the narratological impact of what seeing does, he does not necessarily extend that idea to architecture. Ultimately, the problem for architecture, and I think for this conference, is that there is a Derridian double, a good Derrida and a bad Derrida. The good Derrida opens architecture's presence to a question, opens architecture's signifies to a free play of signifiers, and places architecture's ontological belief in origins of place, i.e. site, into rich nostalgia. The bad Derrida surfaces when he demands that it is necessary for architecture to display, that is, to look like or to represent its textuality, its non-presence in its being. This demand for representation is nothing but a demand for another form of narrative, a narrative that all but erases any possibility of textuality. As Jeff Kipnis will no doubt say following this, Derrida, he would say, did not understand deconstruction in other disciplines, particularly in architecture. I say, in conclusion, before we hear from Jeff, that's all right, Jack. Not many of us understand either. Jeff.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so just 3 questions, and then I'm going to solicit some from the audience. Question number 1 is, how did you answer Colin Rowe? What did you see?
You want me to answer the...
Now, what did you see in the Palladian that wasn't there?
Oh, okay. Well, first of all, when I first answered Colin Rowe, I said, well, it's 3 stories, it's heavily rusticated, it's got symmetrical openings, etc. And he said, no, you can see all of those things. So I didn't understand how to see what wasn't there. But what I began to see was, especially in Palladian villas in the Ghetto, that the outboard windows, that in the outboard bays, were pushed to the edge of the facade. And that edge created a void in the center of the space, which was unusual, let's say, was charged with, as it were, non-presence. That is, it was not traditional in villas to have this void in the center. And at the same time, moving the windows to the extreme of the facade created what one would call edge stress. And edge stress you can't see, non-presence you can't see. So I began to learn how to see as an architect what Palladio was doing that made it, let's say, not only non-narrative, but textual and things that you could not see.
I was thinking the same thing myself. The second question I have for you is going to seem obscure to you, but it's important to us. And that is, have you ever read the Kabbalah?
The answer is to say that I've ever read anything in its full length. I've read the Kabbalah. I haven't understood anything, but yes, I have read in the Kabbalah.
The third question I have for you speaks to something I think quite fortuitous or fortunate. And that is, you speak of the problem that's raised in the Purveyor of Truth as Derrida's questioning of why the handwritten letter is, which is hidden in full view, is actually the termination as a signified. In fact, he problematizes the relationship between the facsimile and the original letter as having any sense of what's a copy and what's the original, or what's the signifier and which is the signified. Earlier today, Mark Wigley said that it is, whether it's true for every architecture or not, there is a tradition in architecture that has guided the discipline that, let's say, the house doesn't represent the family, but it represents the ideality of the family. That we expect architecture to produce a signification not of the truth.
We lost you. I lost you.
Happened a long time ago. Can you got me now?
We got it. I got lost at the idea of the house. I've lost communication.
I mean, I actually had Mark Wigley here. But as I understood it, Mark,
at the idea,
yeah, is that the house or architecture in general will represent, is called upon to represent not the truth of its contents, but the ideality of its contents, much like clothing should represent the ideality of the person.
you're assuming the truth of its contents is it's housing a family. I would,
or let's say housing a happy family.
I would disagree that that's its truth. To assume that it's the truth of a house, I think where you get into trouble.
Okay, but that now poses two architectural possibilities. One is architecture gives up its Pollyanna representation of the ideal truth and tries to represent a deeper truth. Or if we follow your suggestion from the Proline letter, and that architecture doesn't worry about representing truth, non-truth, ideality at all. Okay, right. So I take it you agree with. Okay. So, now, given that, why is that a positive project for architecture? Why? So go ahead.
Just say, why is it a project for architecture?
Okay. Why do you think it's
Jeff?
something? Yes, good. Answer the question. Why is that a project for architecture?
Because any work, a house, a church, a building, a school, a mausoleum, has the necessity, if it is to, as it were, put forward its view of the quality of architecture. That is, as literary qualities are important to defeat, let's say, the narrative, because literary qualities stand outside of the narrative of the good soldier or whatever. So do architectural qualities stand outside the functioning, the base functioning of the work. So I would argue that anybody interested in doing architecture must at all consider what is the architectural, the implications for the discipline, for the culture of architecture, the precedents of architecture, the critique of architecture. The question, putting into question architecture is more important as a project of architecture than housing the happy family.
Before I ask the audience...
You get it?
Yeah, we got it. Yeah. Said what I thought.
What else? I mean,
Doug, can you hear me?
Say.
Can you hear me?
You know?
No, this is wonderful. You want to go to just audio? Hey, tech guys. All right, let's come back. Oh, I see. Turn off.
Now I can hear you.
Okay. You said earlier that the conflict between Lacan and Derrida would be easy to translate into architecture.
Yeah, but you stop.
No, I'm asking you, it doesn't seem evident. Oh, it's okay. Are you there? there?
I'm back online.
Yeah, you there? Okay, so I think
Yeah.
you're not on video.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah.
A couple of quick questions. You were in the middle of telling us how you would describe the difference between a Lacanian architecture and a Doridian architecture.
Oh no, I didn't say I would be able to do that. I said I'm working on finding out the difference between a Lacanian and a Doridian view of their discipline, that is the literary subject, and what its analogous relationship to architecture might be. That's the project we're working on. This is an introduction to that project. I intend to continue to work on it because I think it's an interesting argument.
Do you have an intuition of how it would redirect your work?
I think it would more confirm what I've always felt about the value of the Doridian project in architecture as opposed to either Deleuzian or Lacanian. I think it would more confirm what I've always intuitively felt.
So I have two questions from the audience. The first question is, would you be able to speculate on what it would mean to do an objet petit a, or petit a, the Lacanian idea of a small a object? Would that be a meaningful question for you in architecture?
Well, could I speculate on, could I think of how I would do that in a real project? Yes, I think I could.
Would you do it right now?
It would not be what I do now, let's put it right.
Okay, so get back to this on that, will you? And then the other one is in your drawings, in your process drawings, there are many, many reverberations and states. And then eventually you pick one and you physicalize it. And the question from the audience is, how do you imagine the experience of the subject in relation? Am I doing this one? Or whoever? No?
I never, but Jeff,
Yes.
I never imagined the experience of the subject. I am honestly uninterested, as I believe Jacques Derrida and any other people who are concerned with their own project, how people receive that project.
But so does that mean you only have an intellectual sense of the consequence of your work, not an existential sense?
No. I'm in a building right now which gives me an enormous amount of joy, the DAA building in Cincinnati, for its spatial feeling. That doesn't mean that somebody who doesn't have a similar sensibility to me appreciates it at all. And so I do absolutely am interested in its existential qualities. What I worry about is the project of affect, and you know that is something that disturbs me quite a deal, because I look around me and see the project of affect becoming more and more dominant, which I would call the project of a kind of neo-positivism. That is a neo-interest in presence and phenomena. So I don't want to say my approach is intellectual, but I would say it's conceptual. I never would call it intellectual.
Well, would you say that when you're in your buildings, whether the Wexner Center, the DAAP, or even Santiago, that there is a compelling demand on the architecture on your attention? That essentially the architecture is constantly asking whoever is there to pay attention to it, even to pay close attention to it?
Yes, I would agree.
And do you think, for example, in a museum where you are hoping to pay attention to works of art, or in a school where you're hoping to pay attention to the professor, or in the institutions where architecture is expected to recede into the background, there is a justification for your demand on that level of attention?
Well, first of all, it's not my level of demand, it's architecture's level of demand. And there's so little architecture around that demands attention that I wouldn't worry about it as a problem. If you take the number of buildings at Ohio State University where you teach, Yale University where I teach, University of Cincinnati where I am, the number of buildings that demand attention is microscopic compared to all of the other clutter, which also demands a different kind of attention. That is visual clutter that is involved in our daily lives. So I wouldn't worry about your question. We need more of what we do.
Okay. Before I say goodbye, I'm going to see if there's any more questions from the audience participants. Let me tell you that in the most admiring and controversial way, your work and the work of Jacques Derrida has been a constant presence in our discussion today. I think it's really fantastic that you were at least able to talk to the audience. And let me say thank you very much for doing that. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll be there one of these days, but thank you all, and keep the faith.
Okay. Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye, Peter.